Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you. My name is Nick Hill. I'm a third-year law student at Northeastern University School of Law. Thank you. I am also from a new organization called Jewish Law Students Advocating for Justice. Thank you. Just founded at Northeastern recently. It is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Molly Crabapple, who is a New York-based artist and author whose upcoming book is about the history of the Jewish Labor Bund. You can also find her first two novels, Brothers of the Gun, a memoir of the Syrian War, and her personal memoir, Drawing Blood, at the Born Brown, All Rights Reserved bookstore right outside. Book table right outside. And Molly is willing to sign any copies that folks have or are going to purchase, and I believe there are a few signed copies already out there. And the discussion will be moderated by Professor Hasia Diner, who is the Paul and Sylvia Steinberg Professor of American Jewish History at New York University and the director of the Goldstein-Gorin Center for American Jewish History. So thank you so much, and let's get going.
Thank you so much, everyone. During his elder years, my great-grandfather, the post-impressionist artist Samuel Rothbard, tried to paint back into existence the murdered world of his shtetl childhood. Amidst the hundreds of watercolors that he called memory paintings, one stood out. A girl, silhouetted against some cottages, her dress the same color as the twilight sky above. A moment before, she had hurled a rock through one now shattered cottage window. On the painting's margin, her boyfriend offers more rocks. A lady shouldn't have to carry her own rocks. Itka the Bundist breaking windows, Sam captioned the work. I may have been 15 or 17 or 20 when I saw that watercolor in my great-aunt's sun-baked living room or my mother's apartment. I don't recall exactly where. What sticks with me is the old-world awkwardness of the heroine's name, Itka. I turned the Yiddish symbols on my tongue, and Bundist, what was that? This question became a thread that led me to the Bund, a revolutionary society of which my mother's grandpa Sam had been a member, whose story was interwoven with the agonies and triumphs of Jews in Eastern Europe, and whose name has all but been erased. Founded in 1897 in Vilnius in modern-day Lithuania, and reaching its height in interwar Poland, the Bund was a sometimes clandestine political party whose tenets were humane, socialist, secular, and defiantly Jewish. Bundists fought the Tsar, battled pogroms, educated shtetls, and ultimately helped lead the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Though the Bund was largely obliterated by Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, the group's opposition to Zionism better explains their absence from current consciousness. Though the Bund celebrated Jews as a nation, they irreconcilably opposed the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. The diaspora was home, the Bund argued. Jews could never escape their problems by the dispossession of others. Instead, Bundists adhered to the doctrine of Dokheit, or here-ness. Jews had the right to exist in freedom and dignity wherever they lived. My great-grandfather, Sam Rothbard, was born in 1882 in Volkovisk, a podunk town in the Russian Empire's Pale of Settlement, the crescent of land to which most Jews were then legally confined inside the empire. Tsarist law banned Jews from the Russian heartland and put strict limits on their rights to education, land ownership, and residence. Seeking to deflect popular frustration, courts staged blood libel trials, and the secret police distributed the protocols of the Elders of Zion. When pogroms broke out, cops and soldiers often joined in. This racialized persecution inspired a group of young Jewish Marxists to create the Bund in 1897. They would fight for democratic socialism in Russia, but also for the freedom of their own people. As their founder, Arkady Kremer, said at the Bund's inaugural conference, Jewish workers suffer not only as workers, but as Jews, and we dare not and cannot remain indifferent at such a time. That same year, Theodor Herzl launched the World Zionist Organization at a ritzy casino in Basel, Switzerland, and Bundists and Zionists hated each other from the start. To the Bund, Zionism was submission to the same bigots who wanted to kick Jews out of their homes in Eastern Europe. We are not strangers here and not guests, even though the Russian government considers us as such, one Bund local committee wrote in 1903. The richness of this land is soaked through with our blood. We demand and fight for that which belongs to us, for civil, human, and political rights. To leave meant letting their tormentors win. The Bund coined a word for this stubborn insistence on staying. Dolkeit, here-ness, as opposed to the there of Palestine. Bundists would fight for freedom and safety in the places where they lived, in defiance of everyone who wanted them dead. One can see in this Yiddish term a precursor echo of the Palestinian concept of samud, the steadfast determination to stay on their land despite the predations of the Israeli state. As an exploited young leather worker, my great-grandfather, Sam Rothbard, joined the Bund in 1898 to fight for better work conditions. He quickly plunged into a life of labor strikes, industrial sabotage, and prison breaks that took him out of the conservative religious community of his birth. When the revolution wave came, he later wrote, quote, "I became a world brother. There was no Jew, no Goy, and no God." Eventually, the political persecution would send him fleeing across the ocean. Sam arrived in New York City in 1904, where he became an artist. He taught my mother to paint. She, in turn, taught me. That year, the Bund had grown to 30,000 members. This made it the most popular revolutionary party in the Tsarist Empire, dwarfing both the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. The party's armed idealists organized unions, battled pogroms, then fought on the barricades of the revolutions of 1905 and then of 1917. Crushed by the Bolsheviks after the October Revolution, the Bund regrouped in the newly independent Poland. Over the next 2 decades, the Bund would create a vibrant counterculture that encompassed every stage and aspect of life. For the children of Jewish socialist parents, there was Skiff, with its anthem, "We are young and the world is open." Teenagers joined the Bund's youth movement, Zukunft, the future, and the Bundist women's movement fought for birth control and free childcare. Through their network of schools, choirs, summer camps, and newspapers, the Bund introduced Poland's impoverished Jewish working class to high art and internationalist socialism. They unionized sweatshops and fought evictions. They elevated Yiddish, the much derided language of the Jewish street, into a vehicle of transnational literary culture, a portable homeland that could be carried on the tongue. Believing that the oppressed should write their own histories, working class intellectuals excluded from the academy created YIVO, an institute for the study of Eastern European Jews, in much the same spirit as young Black and Puerto Rican radicals like my father created ethnic studies departments in 1970s New York. The Bund's methods remind me of those of America's Black Panther Party, another group of young radicals who carried guns and started free breakfast programs and asserted their people's beauty in a country that wanted them dead. Like the Panthers, the Bund was a Marxist party, built by and for oppressed and racialized others, who created a network of communal care and cultural uplift, of schools, clinics, mutual aid centers, and youth groups, backed with weapons and branded with militant chic. Every May Day, tens of thousands of Jewish socialists marched through Warsaw beneath the Bund's banner. Their slogan was, "There where we live is our country," and by their actions, they sought to prove it. Such here-ness was hard-won in interwar Poland. Large swaths of Polish society were virulently racist, considering Jews as a tumor that needed to be excised from the body politic. The National Democrats, one of the country's most popular political parties, demanded that all Jews be deported to either colonized Madagascar or to Palestine. Things grew worse when Poland's founding father, Marshal Józef Pilsudski, died in 1935. The men who replaced him were puffy military blowhards, lacking even a smidgen of daddy's charisma. Seeking to use anti-Semitism as a rallying principle, they tolerated pogroms, funded terroristic youth paramilitaries, organized boycotts of Jewish businesses, and introduced racial segregation at Polish universities. Under the leadership of a scar-faced bruiser named Bernhard Goldstein, the Bund organized armed defense of their communities, sometimes with the support of Christian comrades in the Polish Socialist Party. The Zionist movement took a different tact. At the same time as the Polish government funded wannabe brown shirts to terrorize Jewish neighborhoods, it lavished cash on Zionist militias wreaking havoc in Palestine. The Haganah, the Irgun, and the deranged Lehi, also known as the Stern Gang, all received machine guns and military training from the poisonously anti-Semitic Polish government, which they then used to murder Palestinians during the Great Arab Revolt of 1936 through 1939. Recruits to these training centers had to sign pledges to leave Poland immediately after training so as not to use their skills to defend their own Jewish communities. While the Polish government brayed for the mass deportation of their own Jewish citizens, Zionist leaders like David Ben-Gurion and Vladimir Jabotinsky pranced about on Polish stages to agree. Zionists and European racists agreed on one thing: Jews to Palestine. All of this filled the Bund with disgust. While the Bund had banned Zionists from membership in 1901, their opposition to the ideology reached its height in interwar Poland. The Bund loathed Zionism's nationalism, its racism, its contempt for the Jewish diaspora, and its slavish dependence on British bayonets. When riots broke out in Palestine in 1929, killing dozens of Jewish residents, Jewish communities around the world plunged into mourning that quickly morphed into calls for bloody vengeance. Only the Bund refused to participate, blaming the riots on Zionism, which they said had collaborated with the British occupation to deny Palestinians their political rights. Instead, the Bund held a 3,000-person mass rally at Warsaw's Splendid Theater under the banner "Liquidate Zionism." Their resolution read, quote, "The nationalist demonstrations that Zionists have organized exploit the victims of these tragic events and the understandable upset of the Jewish community. This meeting calls on Jewish workers to fight the storm of nationalism and chauvinism that Zionists are unleashing on the Jewish street. The answer to tragically, but pointlessly, spilled blood cannot lie in more national hatred, which will inevitably lead to more communal clashes, but in international solidarity and the growth of the socialist movement." In Poland, the Zionist movement responded by trying to shut down the Bund's school system. Due to their intractable opposition to nationalism, the Bund was more skeptical towards the Great Arab Revolt of 1936 to 39, but they still placed the ultimate blame for the revolts on the Zionist movement. which as their newspaper, Neue Volkszeitung, wrote in 1937, quote, has taken upon itself to settle people in a home that is for the most part occupied by others in order to take control of all of it with the assistance of the house superintendent. In 1938, Polish Zionists attempted to make a coordinating committee of Jewish groups to fight against the worsening situation of the country. The Bund refused to join. To explain the decision, their leader, Henryk Ehrlich, described how Zionism collaborated with racist Polish government officials who sought to expel Jews from the country. Zionism, in point of fact, has always been a Siamese twin of anti-Semitism, Henryk Ehrlich wrote. Quote, Zionism has always regarded the law of force, of nationalistic action, as the normal law of history, and on this law has based its perspectives on Jewish life. In the 40 years of its existence, it has always appeared lost and helpless in the presence of any victorious freedom movement. The Zionists regard themselves as second-class citizens in Poland, and their aim is to be first-class citizens in Palestine and make Arabs second-class citizens. The establishment of Israel would lead to perpetual war with its neighbors and the people it had dispossessed, Ehrlich knew. Quote, if a Jewish state should arise in Palestine, its spiritual climate will be eternal fear of the external enemy, Arabs, eternal struggle for every bit of ground with the internal enemy, Arabs, and an untiring struggle for the extermination of the language and culture of the non-Hebraized Jews of Palestine. Is this a climate in which freedom, democracy, and progress can grow? Indeed, is it not a climate in which reaction and chauvinism ordinarily flourish? Ehrlich asked. By 1939, the Bund's communal self-defense had made them the most popular Jewish political party in Poland. The Nazis invaded that year on September 1st. They resisted from the first day of the occupation. Bundist Councilman Arthur Ziegelbaum publicly implored Jews to refuse to go into the ghetto. Once inside, the Bund continued their resistance, educating kids in underground schools, circulating illegal newspapers, singing rebel songs. They sent their operatives undercover to expose the existence of the Treblinka death camp, and through the Polish Home Army courier Jan Kurski, gave the rest of the world the first reports of the Holocaust. In 1943, in the Warsaw Ghetto, young Bundists, Zionists, and communists finally united to launch the legendary uprising. It was the first urban revolt in occupied Europe, but courage did nothing to change the realities of power. Nazis murdered 90% of Poland's Jews, and the Soviet Union murdered the Bund's leaders, who had fled there seeking safety. After the war, pogroms continued in decimated Poland, where nationalists murdered at least 1,000 Jews. The majority of survivors fled to squalid displaced persons camps in Western Germany, occupied by the United States. They rotted there for years, applying for visas to Western democracies that refused to accept them. The Zionist movement quickly seized control of the camp administrations, using their power to convince and sometimes coerce thousands of Jewish survivors to fight in Palestine. Despite everything, the Bund maintained its opposition to the creation of a Jewish state. Quote, deeply grieved and shaken by the murder of 6 million of their brethren, the masses of Jewish people became enveloped by strong nationalist tendencies, which, fanned by skillful Zionist propaganda, caused amongst Jews a psychosis of Zionist and Messianic illusions, wrote the Bund's coordinating committee in 1948. When Zionist paramilitaries ethnically cleansed 750,000 Palestinians from their homes during the Nakba, the Bund demanded the right of return for those refugees. Israel, of course, would do no such thing. For Israel to exist, Palestine could not. The Israeli army tortured Palestinians who tried to return or shot them as infiltrators. Their property became booty for the new Israeli state. The Bund, meanwhile, seemed to dwindle into irrelevance. It would never again be a mass movement. Its groups were largely support communities for Holocaust survivors, and its International Coordinating Committee finally shuttered in 2003, though a branch still remains in Melbourne. When I post about the Bunds on social media, Zionists sometimes gloat about how many of their members were gassed in Auschwitz. They sometimes wish me the same fate. This makes me think of fascism's first form of forgetting. Before fascism erases the other, it must purify the self. It must cut off the dissident, cosmopolitan, and solidaristic parts of its own people's history to foreclose other futures that might be. This accounts for the Bund's erasure and the anger its mere mention provokes. In 1938, Heinrich Ehrlich wrote, "If a Jewish state should arise in Palestine, its spiritual climate will be eternal fear of the external enemy, Arabs, eternal struggle for every bit of ground with the internal enemy, Arabs. Is this not the climate in which reaction and chauvinism ordinarily flourish?" Ehrlich killed himself in a Soviet prison 4 years later. People who knew him there say that he remained a Bundist till the end. Time after time in these party histories, I read the same story. In gulags and concentration camps and on the execution block, the Bundist would leave his final testimony. "I die knowing that I was right." The Bundist periodicals kept the same line, even as they dwindled into irrelevance, crushed by decades defined by American McCarthyism, the Soviet Gulag, and Israeli hegemony. "I was right." Sure you were. That and 295 will get you to Coney Island. What could be stupider than to keep insisting you were right when the whole world says otherwise, when your enemies are triumphant, when even your kids forsake you? And yet, history keeps moving. No victory is final, and neither is any defeat. On October 2023, after an attack led by Hamas, Israel began a genocide in Gaza. On social media, Palestinians exposed the violence that continued since the Nakba, with every house that settlers steal, every gang rape in an Israeli prison camp, and every crater carved by Israeli bombs. The Bund's anti-Zionism, which had so marginalized them during the long decades of Israeli communal dominance, struck a chord on social media, leading a new generation to embrace them. In Berlin, in New York, and even in their home country, Poland, young people have raised the Bund's banner in support of here-ness, of democratic socialism, and of Palestinian liberation. Though the Bund was crushed by the worst totalitarians of our blood-soaked 20th century, their ideals live on. They're carried forward by Jews and non-Jews around the world, including us in this room, we who believe that solidarity is the only thing that can save us, no matter how fraught and fragile it is. We are, as Shal Magid said, the opposition, but we are growing because we are right. Is that enough? No, but it's the only place to start. "I was right," said the man as he went to the gallows. Sometimes, from the distance of years, he looks less like a fool. Instead, he resembles a prophet. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to reading the book when it comes out. So thank you for your talk, but also thank you for writing the book. I was going to begin by asking you how you came upon the Bund, but now we know because it was a family legacy, and that I think is extremely moving, and I think it's one of the most inspirational ways in which history gets written is that when it grows out of a personal story, a personal connection to the past. So I'm going to ask, I'm not going to, I come out of the academic, history background, and so I'm not going to ask you questions the way I would if you were a, colleague in the history department. It's a very different kind of discourse, and one in some ways that I'm less comfortable in. But I guess I want to ask you, before we turn to the audience, what you see as the sort of usable past of this story, because you begin with the idea, I mean, in a way, it runs through the whole talk of Dorkeit. Here we are. Okay, this is, and I think that's in fact the title of your book, Here Where We Live is Our Country. And clearly the Bund was a product of a very specific time and place, a very specific country, one might say more than a country, but obviously the Tsarist Empire, and then the Second Polish Republic. And its message, its organizing principles, its way of understanding the world was very specific to this place. Now, how do we translate Dorkeit to a very different society with a very different constellation of people and different kinds of political legacies and so on? So,
thank you so much for that question. And it's something that I grapple with throughout the book. Obviously, the position of Jews now, I don't need to say, is very different than it was in the Tsarist Empire 100 years ago. And any sort of politics that are done now would necessarily be very different. But where I derive so much inspiration from Dorkeit, as opposed to like the specific political strategies that the Bund did, is that Dorkeit isn't just something for Jews. It's something for every single oppressed and racialized minority who is told that they're an other by society and who nonetheless insist that this is their land, this is their right to stay here. In a world, in a moment where people are trying to be forced into little ethno-states and being told that they should be deported because of the color of their skin, because of their religion, because of some sort of cooked up identity that wasn't even in existence 50 years ago, the notion that people have the right to live in freedom and safety and dignity where they live because they're human is one of the most important things that we can use to stop fascism. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the reasons that I draw so much inspiration from it. And it is not just a lesson for Jews.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I mean, I think it's an interesting context because another part of kind of the history at the same time, and something also that's been erased, is the role of liberal Jews who were not socialists, who were not living in Eastern Europe and the United States, who also opposed Zionism, and who came out very much from the Reform movement, and who had a vision that Zionism was going to be harmful to the Jews. And they, in fact, also noted the presence of people who were living there. And these were individuals who were very much behind a kind of global definition of Jewishness and created institutions and organizations to provide relief to Jews in various places. The Joint is probably the most dramatic example. And interestingly, they really clashed with the Bund.
Though the Bund also worked with the Joint too, especially during the Holocaust.
So eventually they come, but the Bund was very much opposed to working with the
Richie Riches.
Yes, and the fact is that those Richie Riches were funding Jewish life throughout Eastern Europe, and but their history has also been erased as opponents of Zionism.
And I think self-erased, I would say, because as their sort of descendants in American life became Zionists, I think that there was a sort of deliberate forgetting of how much they opposed it at the start.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's a very good point. What about the relationship between the Bund and something we call Judaism? And what does Jewish mean if one says that that's not, that is a part of one's existence that is one is distancing oneself from?
So it's actually really interesting and something that the Bund constantly fought about. This was a major sort of point of tension because the Bundists, they were mostly atheists, at least in their leadership. And so they were trying to make a definition of what being Jewish was that wasn't about God. And in some ways, there's kind of a split because you have these sort of upper-class Bundists, often living in exile, who are going to conferences and hanging out at coffee houses and endlessly thinking about, what does it mean to be a Jew? Am I a Russian or a Jew? What are the boundaries of identity? You know, the way that intellectuals always do. And then you have people like my great-grandfather who only spoke Yiddish and lived in a place that was, 70% Jewish, and moved in an all-Jewish world, and he never asked himself if he was a Jew or not, because it would have been so fucking self-evident that, I mean, what was he supposed to say? Am I a penguin? And I think that when I think about these questions, it's always a conflict between intellectuals who are thinking of like a precise, bounded definition of things, and working class people who often have a sort of more lived reality that's harder to put into words. And I think the Bund's definition of Jewishness was very bound, as you said, by being in Eastern Europe, in these areas that often were like 60% Jewish, where they had their own language, and where this was just like the milieu they were in. Mm-hmm. And they never had the idea that there was like one world Jewish people. Often they would be like quite condescending to Sephardi Jews, and also quite mocking to German Jews, who they definitely viewed as Richie Riches. So I think it was something that was not a particularly intellectually rigorous definition, but that in practice, it didn't need to be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, what about ritual and the way in which Jewish life, ticks around a yearly calendar of holy days, holidays? How did they make sense of that in terms of both what they believed, or what they lived, what they felt, and also how they may have used that to gain adherence for their movement?
Again, it was a very contested thing. On one hand, you often had Bundists celebrating secularized versions of Jewish ritual. For instance, at the Medem Sanatorium, which was the sanatorium they created for tubercular slum kids outside of Warsaw, and which was really like the jewel of their network. They would do Passover, but they wouldn't keep kosher and they wouldn't pray. I think this is something that a lot of American Jews probably recognize from their own lives, where you kind of pick and choose. By the same token, because the Bund came from a working class milieu, a lot of people in their world were religious. And in fact, in the 1930s, the Polish government wanted to ban kosher slaughter. It was just another way of trying to harass Jews out of the country. And even though the Bund didn't really care about kosher slaughter, they led a nationwide strike to protest the ban, because they recognized that this isn't being done out of like some sort of theological thing. This is just being done because you're fucking racist.
Okay, so I think that's okay. I mean, I think maybe this is a good moment to turn to the audience and to see. So okay. Yes, over there.
Hi. I'm wondering, as Americans, how we can use both Deutschheit while also recognizing that we're obviously living on land that has been stolen through the process of genocide, and how we can kind of grapple with both fighting for our right to live safely here and then also participating in like the land back movement.
I mean, thank you. So first of all, by learning Native American history, obviously, which has been so deliberately erased in an act of cultural murder that I think always is contiguous and follows a genocide. Second of all, by supporting Native American movements, including Standing Rock. Now, I don't believe that most land in this world is stolen, right? I don't believe that people don't have the right to live somewhere because it's stolen. I believe that people don't have the right to create a regime of supremacy and murder. And I think that by dismantling that supremacy and stopping the continuous violations against Native American sovereignty, that's how you honor Deutschheit while also honoring the place that you currently live.
Okay. Okay. Yes.
Hello, I'm Francesca. I'm on staff at the Workers' Circle, which also has a long, history with the Bund and with just the kind of international Jewish labor movement. So I just want to thank you very much for your talk and your cultural work. And a question I have is that I, in my work, spend a lot of time working with young people and college students who are so energized by and empowered by Yiddish language learning, by Yiddish culture. And I would just love to hear you talk more about how you see both intergenerational learning and sharing, and how the kind of Gen Z, Gen Alpha sort of youth movement towards an embrace of Yiddish and the Bund, how you hope it'll play out, and how you just interact with kind of this burgeoning interest and joy in Yiddish.
Oh my God, it's so cool. I mean, I learned Yiddish from YIVO. That I feel continuously blessed. I mean, the reason that Yiddish isn't spoken is in large part because, it was a victim of a genocide, right? Just like so many other languages, like Western Armenian or, indigenous languages or Kurdish. These were languages that were viciously suppressed and whose majority often of their speakers were murdered. And so I find that by learning Yiddish, what you're doing is you're reconnecting with a past that was stolen from you. And the same, goes for Ladino, right? Or goes for speaking Judeo-Arabic or, languages of Bukharian Jews. It's not just like a Yiddish thing, or Western Armenian, right? So that's one thing. I also live in a Satmar neighborhood in Brooklyn, and it's really pretty cool to understand the signs and all the dynamics. There's currently a Yiddish language campaign against racy Purim music that I feel pretty blessed that I can understand. And mostly I'm just also excited by all the cultural creation in Yiddish. I mean, there's so much music, there's so much art, there's so much amazing stuff, and this is ours. Why should we not use it? This is our culture.
Okay, let me take from this side, yes. Wait, why don't you wait for the mic? It's coming.
Hi, my name's Lauren. Thank you so much. I'm very excited about this book because A, fascinated by the Bundes, and B, my family's originally from Vilna, so that's very exciting. I've been enjoying and feeling more and more the necessity of learning from the resistance movements of the past, and looking back at what the Bundes did, and what Sophie Scholl and the White Rose did, and other groups who've resisted through fascism and oppression. Are there any tactics that you think the Bundes did, or anything that they did that you think, anything that we should get back in touch with or amplify, and that you just think is a great tactic that we should reacquaint ourselves with?
They were huge organizers in the labor movement, and I think that any resistance to fascism is built on the labor movement. I'm also going to say something that they weren't good at, right? The Bundists, like many leftists, this will shock you about the left, I'm sure, it was very sectarian. And one of the things that I found in my research about the Warsaw Ghetto was that the Bund, and also communists and left Zionists, not just them, but the Bund, they risked their life and starved themselves to get the paper and ink to print illegal newspapers that they then used to denounce other leftist groups for not understanding Marx.
Okay, great. Back to this side. Way in the back there. I think, yeah, I'm being utterly random.
No, and ruthless. I like it.
First, I want to thank you for bringing the Bund's, the important Bund history to a wider audience and doing it so eloquently and inspiringly. As someone who spent most of my adult life trying to figure out how the Bund's ideology, which completely resonated with me, to American circumstances, one argument that I would sometimes get that I found difficult to answer, I was wondering if I could ask you for the answer, and that was the claim that this ideology, which I was sympathetic with, was pushing, endorsing, trying to figure out how to adapt, they said has been, as you pointed out, historically defeated, and that it wasn't simply the prophets who went to the gallows, saying that they were right. They went to the gallows, and the masses that they were trying to convince were the Bundists, Zionists, Hasidim, Mitnagdim, any form of Judaism or Jewish identity, also were slaughtered. So these people say, It may sound cynical and unidealistic, but you have to confront reality. And the reality is that the world is full of nationalism, and that nationalism has proven the only kind of potential safety, and that Bundism had led to the extermination of the population it was trying to serve. So I remain an idealist, but I have difficulty finding a persuasive answer to people that say, history has simply proven the Bund wrong.
Thank you so much for that question, which is something that my book gets into. First of all, a genocide is not an argument. I don't know if there's any other group of people who has ever endured a genocide that spits on its own ancestors that went through it and blames them for it. I think that that's a specific dementia of our community. And I'm sorry that people said that to you. I've heard it many times myself. The second thing is that 75% of the Jews that escaped, of Polish Jews that escaped from the Nazi advance, they did not go to Palestine or America. They went to the Soviet Union. This is not an argument for Stalinism. Where people are able to flee is not an ideological argument. It's just where people are able to flee. If nationalism is the only savior of anything, then the only way that we go forward is by dividing ourselves into smaller and smaller groups that all chop off each other's heads until we're all dead. And I think that the genocide that we're currently seeing in Gaza shows the hollowness and the violence of Zionism, which is the same hollowness and violence of all ethno-nationalisms. All ethno-nationalisms are poison.
Okay, now to this section. Yes. Okay, I'm sorry.
Hi, thank you for your remarks. You sort of alluded to this, but there were other movements that were Zionist that aligned with the Bund in other very important things like socialism and humanistic Judaism, including Hashem Tzair, which was brought up earlier in another of the panels. So I'm wondering, what do you think it was about those particular principles that brought those groups together, and then why was it Zionism? Like, what was it about Zionism that kept them apart, and what was it about socialism that brought them together? Just if you could speak more about, the unity between those groups and then the differences between those groups.
This is a really important thing. So there is a number of socialist Zionist groups, including Polet Zion, Hashem Tzair, as you said, Dror, that did profess socialism. And in many ways, they were engaged in a turf war, I would say, with the Bund, right, for who's going to be the dominant force in Jewish working class, especially young Jewish working class life. In general, they didn't collaborate except on a few very specific circumstances, like on pogrom self-defense and also in the Warsaw Ghetto revolt and in other anti-Nazi revolts. And the thing that drew them together, obviously, is these are like working class Jewish young people who are getting the boot, right? They're working in factories and sweatshops. Socialism would be a very obvious thing to them. But the question of whether you're going to stay somewhere, in Poland, or whether you're going to go to Palestine and be involved in a project of ethnic displacement, it's like a pretty big question. It's kind of like ideologically cuts people to the roots. And while, you had many young people that switched between lots of different youth movements, depending on who they were dating and who had the cool uniforms, this was a pretty ideologically irreconcilable thing,
Let me just add, there was a third option also, which until the 1920s was in fact the most
popular
was emigration to the United States.
Yeah, go to America.
And in a way was to some degree a rejection of the Bund's notion of Dahlkeit. Well, here's this place, again until the 20s. It's a great opportunity for Jews. So 1/3 of the Jews of Eastern Europe come to the United States, which is kind of remarkable statistic. And was not, we want to stay here and build a world in Poland or in the kind of the emerging, so in Tsarist Russia.
Though to complicate that, I would say that many Bundists did come to America, and in fact, a lot of the garment workers' unions owe huge amounts to former Bundists like David Dubinsky and Sidney Hillsman, and Vladek, former Bundist orator, became a major figure in sort of socialist New York politics. And in fact, the Bund in Warsaw had an emigration bureau that helped their members deal with the bureaucracies of immigration to North and South America and Europe. So I wouldn't say that they were dogmatically like, you can never leave here, so much as they were like, you shouldn't go and colonize Palestine.
Okay. Yes, the black and sweet.
You said for your great-grandfather, his Jewishness was obvious in the shtetl, like you didn't have to question it. And I'm wondering how here-ness and the here-ness of Jewishness changes when we're not living in Jewish-only neighborhoods and we're living in a more multicultural society than your great-grandfather would have been.
I mean, I think that, part of modernity, right, is having identities that you're always questioning, that are always contested. I think this is like modernity, like the postmodern condition, and not just for Jews, right, but for everyone. When you're in an oppressed, racialized minority, your identity is foisted upon you. No matter what you feel about it, you might want nothing to do with it at all, but the world keeps telling you it's yours, and I think that was very much what Jews were going through in Tsarist Russia. Many Jews, I'm sure, would have loved to have been just like atheist Russians reading Pushkin. But if you don't have the boot on your face, right, your identity is something that you have to claim positively and define, and that will always seem unstable, and I think that's something that everyone has to wrestle with themselves.
Okay, back to the side. Okay, sir in the back. Black sweater, red shirt. Oh, that's you. Yeah, that's you.
Hello, thank you so much. I think around when I was an undergrad, it seemed like most organizing spaces, I don't know how to put this, sort of were not organized around kind of acknowledging cultural differences. But coming back to grad school and being in the kind of encampment space, it was very different. It was a coalitional space with different groups that represented, for example, black students and Palestinian students and Jewish students, et cetera, which seems like a real change in how organizing is being done, I guess, in US campus spaces. And it seems like there's this simultaneous understanding that each group has its own interests that are important, but also that we need to understand that we all have the ability to do harm and, kind of mediate. So kind of in answer to the question about nationalism earlier, does this sort of maybe relate to a way forward?
I mean, I think that, if you want to live in a diverse country, you deal with diverse experiences. And I mean, in many ways, my own personal belief is not the same as this super coalitional politics. I'm definitely more of a crusty old socialist who believes in unions and sort of cross-identity things. But I think at a moment when people are being really, really victimized for aspects of their identity, right? For instance, people who aren't documented are being really fucked with in a way that people who are American citizens are not. Any sort of organizing very much has to take that into account, which is very different than solely defining yourself by an identity that you might not even feel particularly strongly towards. But I just think, I don't know, I'm a Marxist. I'm a Marxist materialist, and I think we just need to look at reality.
Okay, yes. Thank you. Again, I feel badly for all the people I'm not calling on, so just know that it's bothering me.
You guys, by the way, so after this, I'm going to be at the Born Brown table, which you go out this way, and then you go around. It's the table with the cool keffiyehs. I'm going to be signing books, and you can hang with me there. So after this. Okay. So if anyone's missed, don't feel bad.
Hi. So in the context of the Trump administration now, with a particular focus on systematically attacking and destroying both, trying to destroy both undocumented communities, black and brown communities, and in particular trans communities, the wave of stuff that we've seen over just the past couple weeks, it's really, it's very, very intense. I'm just curious if in all the research and digging that you've done on the Bundes and that history, there's a long history of third genders and other genders in Jewish life and tradition, and what was going on with that? Did you come across anything like that? Well, maybe, and if not, maybe more broadly, if you could talk more about the gender politics of the Bund movement, but if there's anything around sort of trans-Bundist, that's super interesting.
Thank you. And like, my God, fuck Trump, fuck this attempted erasure of trans people. Like, it's fucking, fuck that. So I did some digging on this, but I think this is also, like, there's so much stuff Bundists wrote, and a lot of it is like on microfilm at Evo, which means you have to like, spin a bobbin, it's not searchable. So there's like so much stuff that might be out there that I don't know. So I just need to acknowledge that. In terms of gender politics, the Bund was ostensibly feminist as a Marxist group. When it was in Tsarist Russia, 1/3 of its members were women, which was a really high number for that time, and it had many women in leadership. In my book, I focus on a lot of those women because I'm just more interested, frankly. But interestingly enough, when the Bund became legal or quasi-legal in interwar Poland, the amount of women in leadership went down. And the reason, according to the Bundist leader Anna Rosenthal, was that when the Bund was illegal, what made you advance in the party was being brave. So like if you were running guns, right? If you were smuggling pamphlets, if you were doing these like feats of courage and daring. Whereas once the party became legal, what made you advance was talking at conferences. And apparently men of that era talked more. That was what Anna Rosenthal said. So you had something where there was like so much unexamined sexism by people who thought they were, enlightened about women. I wrote about Sofia Dubnova, who was the wife of the Bund's interwar Polish leader, Henryk Ehrlich, and also the Bund's unofficial sex columnist. And she, wrote about like abortion. She wrote about women's rights to orgasm. She also wrote about these like loser guys in the movement who would use from each according to his ability to each according to his needs to talk about why they needed to get laid. In terms of queer Bundist histories, I haven't found any trans histories. However, Irena Klepfich, my fucking queen, Irena Klepfich told me about her aunt, Gina. So Irena Klepfich is a lesbian poet who was born in the Warsaw Ghetto, and her father, Michael, was the bomb maker in the ghetto, Bundist family. So she told me about her aunt, Gina, and she showed me pictures. And Gina is, in these pictures, dressed up like the hottest butch that you could imagine. Like she has hair that's cropped to here, and she looks kind of like Greta Garbo, and she's wearing like a suit and a tie. And Gina was like really tough. She was an athlete. She would pull people out of the boxcars, like literally physically pull them out and rescue them. And during the war, Gina had a friend whose name was Marysia Sawicka. And Marysia was a fellow athlete from the Polish socialist group, and they traveled together. And they were so close that they stepped in one bed together. And when Irena visited Poland after the war, Marysia, who survived, asked to be buried in Gina's grave. So that's my queer history that I have for the Bund.
Okay, I think one more question, and we have to go to this side, and I don't see anybody there. So, okay, Audrey.
Hello? Okay. Thank you for this presentation. It's life-affirming and incredible. You mentioned briefly the sort of superiority complex around Sephardi Jews.
And German Jews.
And German Jews, which is, I like that twist, right? That's an interesting twist. But I am curious how much you were able to find about any kind of knowledge about or curiosity or relationship to maybe not the exact same political orientation, but other orientations around that were anti-nationalist in other parts of the Jewish diaspora. If you came across any in the Middle East, and if so, what that looked like, and if not, if you have any thoughts about, why that might be that you didn't, if there were relationships with the wider Jewish diaspora and what that looked like, especially in the Middle East.
Yes, I did find something, actually, which I'm really excited about, and I hope someone will dig more into it. So in the Bund's Foreign Committee archives at YIVO, I found a letter in French that was or correspondence actually in French between the Bund and the Socialist Workers' Federation of Salonika, which was a Sephardic-led group led by a socialist named Avram Ben Oroya that was hugely popular in Salonika. It contained Bulgarians and Turks and Greeks, but was primarily Sephardic. And they have an exchange where they're talking about how to combat the rise of Zionism in their communities, which is being sort of stoked by the racism that both communities are dealing with from the larger societies. And if anyone knows French and wants to research this, I can tell them what folder it's in, and they can dig more in it. But yeah, it's about 4 letters. And that's the only thing that I personally know that's like a real like collaborative exchange. They also reported on anti-Zionist demonstrations by Jews in Damascus and by Jews in the Arab world in their newspapers.
Okay, I think we're at, I'm looking, cut. Okay, so thank you for the audience, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Okay.